then I think we can go ahead and get started with Jeff. I'll let you introduce yourself too, Jeff, if you want to say anything further, but Jeff is Program Director for Cultural Anthropology at NSF, as well as Program Director for the Dynamics of Integrated Socio-Environmental Systems program, and is NSF's Human Subjects Research Officer. So I will just go ahead and turn it over to you then, Jeff, and we can get started.
The longer you're at NSF, the more signature lines they have in your signature block. It's they just sort of give you new responsibilities. That's their idea of promotion. So I mean, I have the usual sort of dog and pony show that the slides that they have, and I always sort of joke that people's are not necessarily interested in the thousands of organizational charts that we have and those sorts of things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the entire PowerPoint into the chat box here. Hopefully that'll work. That won't work. Try it. No, looks like I can't do that. I'm going to do a note, show my notes here. Oh, wait, do this to everybody.
That might work as a note.
Try a note. That didn't work. I'll email it to you.
Yeah, you know what, Jeff, if you want to email it to me, then I'll email it now to you all.
All right.
So I know everybody's
30 seconds.
Great, thanks.
I've got 3 huge monitors. And the email one is over here. I'm going to find you. Come on. It doesn't work because it's open. Give me 1 second. Sorry.
No worries.
There we go. Outlook wouldn't let me send it because I had it open. But yeah, I've been at NSF for 8.5 years now. I was an academic before that, before I went to the dark side. I taught for 11 years in a number of anthropology departments, George Mason and the Cal State system. I taught at Vassar for a couple of years. So I had a life in 3 different kinds of institutions, sort of a mid-level research institution, an R1, and some all over arts college. My own research is as an economic anthropologist, I look at sort of the drivers of inequality, what sorts of commodity chains for supply chains for various things that are necessary to make digital products and that sort of stuff. That's most of what NSF funded was my research on that. And in fact, one of the programs that I have a foot in now is something run through engineering called Disrupting Illicit Supply Networks, which is the engineers are concerned about the illegal trafficking originally in humans, but also in wildlife and illegal minerals and a range of other things, nuclear materials and that sort of stuff. And humans kind of get in the way of the plans to disrupt those chains. So it's become this massive sort of interdisciplinary program that really has a strong social science component. It's one of the interesting secrets about NSF is how interdisciplinary and how convergent the research is here, and how reliant it is on the social sciences. Social sciences at NSF constitute only about 4% of the budget of NSF, but when you look at where social scientists are active around the foundation, it's much more representative, which is why my program might be cultural anthropology because that's who I am and what I do, but the longer you're here, the more you find that you need really a stake in a number of different things to get better at guiding your research community about how they should go about what they're doing. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Hopefully that works. All right. So are you seeing anything? Looks like you are. Okay. This is my first time using WebEx in a while. We switched to
it looks great. And I just managed to send everybody the file as well. So you all should have that momentarily.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
So if we were doing a 2-hour-long version of this, I might go through more systematically through this. I'm not going to really dwell on this, but except to sort of emphasize a few high points here. The organization that you're applying to is always important in terms of thinking about how to frame what it is that you're doing. This is important, especially in anthropology, where we kind of run the gamut in anthropology from people who are doing like complex mathematical modeling and graph theory and those sorts of things to people who are not doing field work at all, that are kind of border on literature, actually, a more sort of philosophical wing, and people kind of occupy different nodes and niches along that spectrum at various points in their career as well. So one of my more one of the articles that I like to sort of tout it was something that was produced in a journal called Anthro and Humanism, and you would think that the guy at the NSF wouldn't have done anything sort of humanistic, but as a result of that, the work that you're doing may transform at any particular point in time, particularly at UMBC, where there's this strong sort of public health component. And a number of you might find that a lot of the work that you're doing is actually appropriate for NIH. But then when it's not about a specific sort of disease outcome or resolving that specific sort of disease outcome, but it's trying to sort of test larger sorts of questions, maybe it falls under the purview of something like NSF. So those mission statements, they kind of look really tautological, that you sort of can expect what they're going to say based on the name of the organization. I bet National Science Foundation is going to say something about science in the mission statement. I bet NIH is going to say something about health. And in fact, they do. But they're actually really useful in terms of thinking about how things are framed and oriented. Am I doing an applied project that's really about trying to address public health concerns? Am I doing something that's about promoting anthropology generally? Am I doing something that's about trying to forge connections between different sorts of nations, or improve the capacity that the United States has to have a strong educational base? Those are all different sorts of programs that exist around the federal government and private organizations, depending on whether you're looking at Winter Gren, which is an anthropological foundation, or SSRC, or Fulbright, which is run out of the State Department, or Fulbright Hayes, which is run out of the Department of Education. I like to start off by asking, what it is that you're trying to do, and is this something that's more sort of is your heart really in trying to address an age-old enduring question in philosophy, or treat a particular kind of disease, or do something that's sort of more systematic and theory testing, and that should be how you think about where you want to target your initial applications. So just a little bit on the history of social science at NSF, and I do this just to make a point. We're the other science in the mission. We weren't specifically named as a social, we weren't included as part of the sort of itinerary, but we are in that other group, and we always have been. The debates around the NSF and the role of social sciences have always sort of been fraught, and I like to pull out this quotation from a congressman in 1946 who talks about social scientists who are short-haired women and long-haired men kind of getting out. This is 1946 he's speaking in, by the way. That sort of caricature is old as the social sciences are. That's 75 years old now, and it's something that we've always contended with, but we've always been here. We were anthropology, my home discipline, was part of the original 4 disciplines at NSF when a social research science program was created. And we weren't actually a separate directorate until 1992. Previously, we were in biosciences directorate. It's important to ask yourself what your objective is in terms of the kind of funding that you're looking for. I notice, especially among anthropologists, that there's a tendency to want to ask for funds really to support the literary cycle of the anthropologist, the kind of production of a monograph. And often we get proposals that are kind of more or less channeling what the monograph should be based on the research rather than the actual sort of fact-finding mission. And that makes sense because they're, you need funds that's ideally what you would like to be working on, but it's not the kind of thing that a research granting organization is going to fund. Fellowships are really designed to support the individual. And they really, in supporting the person, they're really concerned about who the person is and what their trajectory is. When you're focused on the project itself and on you're looking for a grant, the person becomes less important. I always do, when I do this talk to students, I always say, by the time you're a tenured professor, nobody cares about you as a person anymore, and there's no fellowships left. It's important in terms of thinking about how exactly you're framing the research and what it is that you're doing. Really, when it gets down to you as a person, this is going to vary from directorate to directorate. In the biological sciences, for example, they're very concerned about the research productivity of people who have previously applied and received grants. See less of that in the social sciences. You might see more of it in a discipline like economics, for example, but less so in, say, anthropology. But by and large, when they're looking at the person, they're looking at, is this person qualified? Is the research feasible? No, they're not. It's not a popularity contest, and it's not about how erudite you've made yourself sound in the proposal. They really are focused on the project itself. When you think about basic research, you want to think about what's foundational and theory testing rather than trying to solve a particular problem or an application of existing knowledge to address some sort of concern. There's a chart. I'm going to skip the organizational charts, but there's one that this one gets the psychologists here are responsible for this. But it's a useful heuristic. Where you don't want to be is in the bottom left-hand corner where you don't even get a name. But ideally, we want somebody who is certainly doing some kind of basic research in that upper left-hand quadrant. If they can have use-inspired basic research, that means that they also have the broader impacts of the research down. But we aren't an organization that supports purely applied research. So you want to be able to demonstrate that the questions that you have are generalizable, that they're empirically driven, that the data that you collect is going to be able to address those sorts of questions. Those are some of the main sorts of concerns that we have. What else was here? Another sort of common thing that we see, particularly among a number of the social sciences, is the tendency to want to conduct an intervention, to do politically motivated research. You see this in subfields in anthropology and sociology and political science, where people are trying to address some sort of social problem. And certainly our concerns about social problems drives what it is that we do and why we do it. But the motivation should be more sort of neutral and more about fact-finding and more about putting the assumptions that you have at risk, rather than letting your assumptions drive the actual research. One of the more interesting things about having been at NSF for a while and seeing a number of different projects and trying to get a sense of what constitutes good social science and what doesn't, is that some of the most interesting social science is the stuff that kind of demonstrate something fundamentally counterintuitive. You would never think that this would actually be the case, but in fact it is. Or discoveries that just sort of happen by accident. You're looking at one thing and you stumble onto another. Our assistant director, the person who's responsible for heading the social sciences, a political scientist from the University of Michigan, he likes to pull out an example from a project at UC Berkeley that I funded a number of years ago. That was, by all accounts, a fairly boring project on land tenure in West Africa. So it was, it's interesting to like political and economic anthropologists who are concerned with what kind of sort of social organization happens from generation to generation with land transfers and so forth, and what are the rules for land tenure and land transfer and so forth. But for most other people, this isn't really exciting stuff. But it became really socially relevant several years ago when the research team just happened to be here in Sierra Leone at the time of the Ebola outbreak. And they were able to tell the CDC and WHO, hang on, there's certain kinds of funerary and rights and mortuary rights that need to take place for land to transfer between generation to generation. This is a pathway for contagion of Ebola. Suddenly this $200,000 project on land tenure becomes really relevant to public health. Being open to discovery, being open to sort of the notion that your fundamental assumptions might be wrong as sort of the good kind of approach to think of in terms of working with the NSF. You guys have this, so I'm not going to deal with everything here, but there's a number of other programs that might be of interest to social scientists, and not all of them are, always highlighted as things like 10 big ideas or something like that. There's of course DICES, which is formerly CNH. There's and a couple of others I've mentioned, but there's interesting sorts of programs like if you work on disasters. There's a program in engineering called Human Disasters in the Built Environment. I kind of liked it better when it was called Infrastructure Management and Extreme Events. But this has actually supported a fair number of social scientists who are concerned with how actually disasters unfold, what are the sort of pathways to resilience and vulnerability and all these sorts of things. And we've had a good working relationship with them. There's a new program called Human Networks and Data Science that's supporting widely across the, they're supporting 2 anthropologists, and just, or they're about to. I guess the awards aren't out yet, but yeah. This is what you really want to hear. So what do good proposals and bad proposals look like? There's 2 merit review criteria at NSF. There's intellectual merit, which is kind of more or less what you think it is. It's what is the merit of conducting this research? What kinds of theoretical questions is it capable of answering? What sort of science gets advanced from it? Is the team feasible? The team qualified to do it? Is the project feasible? All the sort of things about the ensure the likelihood of success. And then there's this other thing called broader impacts, and that has to do with the benefits to society, which creates some confusion among PIs sometimes who look at this and say, wait a second, I thought NSF was into basic science, and this sounds like it's interested in applications. Yes, that's something that we're constantly sort of dealing with, and it's not that you need to create deliverables, but you need to sort of identify potential pathways for delivery of those sorts of things. And some of these can be sort of rather standard and mechanical. So a social good, for example, might be, as far as NSF is concerned, is building the STEM workforce. So if you're training graduate students or undergraduates or a postdoc, that's training, that's professionalizing the future STEM workforce. That's considered a broader impact. If you're broadening the participation of groups that are historically underrepresented in science, that's considered a social good because you're capitalizing on your nation's potential to do the best possible science that it can by including groups that have been excluded historically. So it's not that you have to identify a way to treat a disease or solve a problem. But if you have methods of disseminating your information in non-standard, non-scholarly sorts of venues, that's something you definitely want to know, want to hear about. I won't say much about this except that the research questions or hypotheses are probably the most important part of the proposal. They should appear very early in the proposal, and they're probably the ones that you'll have to rewrite the most number of times and multiple drafts. I see a lot of proposals in anthropology that spend an awful lot of time on their literature reviews. And because that's, if you were writing a journal article, that's what you would spend a lot of time on, is covering the literature. And you know, I worked as a paralegal in law school, and a lot of what academics do to me looks exactly like what lawyers do, where they're making sure that they're citing all the case law. And I found it equally banal and as a paralegal as I do as an academic. But it's, you know, certainly good coverage of the literature is important, but it's good coverage to a particular end. Like, it's good coverage to make sure that you're asking questions that are relevant and appropriate for pushing the field forward. I always like to say a research proposal should look prospectively at the contribution that you can make rather than retrospectively at what's been done in the past. If you're thinking of yourself as part of an intellectual tradition that you want to continue to sort of propitiate in some way, you're less likely to advance the field in new ways. And that, while that trend is more common in humanistic writing, where people say are interested in a decolonial feminist Lacanian approach to something, and they want to sort of invoke that tradition in interpreting a text or a piece of art or a philosophical tradition, and that makes for interesting scholarship a lot of the time. When you're dealing with humans that are changing their behavior constantly and doing things that are disruptive and nonlinear, presumably a static sort of textual approach to it is not going to be as effective as something that's designed to sort of capture human behavior in motion. So thinking prospectively about the contribution that you might have as things change just gives you a much more dynamic way of approaching it. And then just some other bits of advice here. You know, alternative research questions or alternative hypotheses are always a good idea. They just create a sort of, the more open-ended your questions are, the less you sort of trap yourself into a set of assumptions, I think. A gap isn't really a rationale for a contribution. You know, correlations aren't the same thing as causations. Usually when somebody says something like, nothing has been written on this subject, that's often not true. It's just that it hasn't been written in that subfield or in that geographic region or in that discipline. It's probably been taken up somewhere. And then focusing on the research contributions and not the scholarly products is a good idea. So I see a lot of projects that you know, describe basically the literary strategy that too much has been written about this and not enough about this. It's been too oriented towards you know, a privileging of this category and not enough towards that. That might be a good sort of conceptual framework to enter the problem, but you want to make it clear what would be gained by asking those questions. If you're suggesting that you just need to sort of shift the genre of writing a little bit, it actually closes off inquiry and makes it seem like the data doesn't matter. And then some habits to avoid. You know, make sure you're you're not channeling your assumptions. Whenever I see this research will show that in the beginning of a research proposal, I know that it's not getting funded. Empty methodological categories are somewhat common in my discipline. I can't tell me how many times I've seen grounded theory with a you know, a 1967 citation right after it, and then nothing else. It's not even clear the person actually knows what it means or has read that text. You know, try to take jargon out. You know, try to not use the passive voice in a proposal. You want it to seem as active and explicit as possible. You know, I always think reading outside of your geographic area, if you're an anthropologist or geographer or somebody where place really matters, is really a good idea, or outside of your thematic area. works. In economics, for example, some of the most interesting economic advances have happened when they're turning to disciplines like game theory or our political science or psychology to ask questions that economists have struggled with in terms of asking other sorts of questions. So you find it across the board. I won't dwell on these, but there's a number of different options. There are some disciplines that kind of map easily onto programs. So cultural anthropology is called cultural anthropology. Linguistic anthropology, also called cultural anthropology. Political science has two names now. There's two programs associated with it. Psychology has at least five. So you've got a development psychology program. It used to be development and learning sciences, and then now there's a science of learning and there's a developmental psychology program. There's a couple cognitive psych programs that are interested in neuroscience and perception, action, and cognition. There's a decision, risk, and management science program that'll fund a lot of psychologists. It's a science of organization program. So what you see in the social sciences is increasingly sort of following what you see around the foundation, where they're interested in research areas rather than disciplines per se. DICES is kind of a reflection of that as well. It was a sort of a couple natural human systems, or a couple human natural systems. Chance as a sort of a common discipline for some time, and then they wanted to sort of emphasize the integrated nature of it, so they reframed the solicitation. But you see some standing programs, but you don't just look at the standing program that you might sort of associate as your home discipline. Look at others. Ask us at NSF to help you. On average, we find about 1/4 of the projects that we see. That's going to vary from discipline to discipline. Some programs fund more. The amount of the awards is going to change. And then there's a number of different other opportunities. I'm happy to talk about careers and mid-careers and eagers and rapids and those sorts of things. I just wanted to get through this. And if you have students who are interested too, I'm happy to talk about the different student initiatives. And then this little thing at the end is just, if you need a code for your own, for a specific program, let me know, but I just put the ones up there for anthropologists. This is how you can do sort of targeted searches for what's been funded. Every project that's been funded by NSF is considered part of the public domain. It can be FOIA'd. There's no reason to FOIA it. You can just write to the PI, and usually they'll just send you a PDF of their grant submission. But those are really useful in terms of developing the skills necessary to submit a successful proposal. And it was a little over 30 minutes, which was what I was aiming for. So I'm going to stop screen sharing if I can figure out how to do that, and just answer questions about anything that you want to talk about.
That's great, Jeff. Thank you so much. Does anybody have a question? That I have one or two that I'm going to ask at some point, but I want anybody to chime in if you have something that you want to ask first. Okay, so I would love, actually, Jeff, two quick things. One, I kind of want to go back to all of your slides were really great and gave some really helpful specific tips. So I really appreciate that. I would love to go back to that part that you talked about, which is sort of that almost that tension between basic science and broader impacts. Because the reason that resonates with me is because I actually had a proposal where they said the broader impacts are amazing, and you spend so much time on them that you undersold the intellectual merit. So we weren't as fleshed out on the methodology, and we weren't as fleshed out even on, cutting down the lit review and so forth. And in fact, part of the reason why that proposal I think wasn't successful is that we narrated it as a two-pronged study, not as science plus broader impacts. We've now resubmitted it, reframed as basic study, which we have fleshed out more, and then changed that sort of working together in participatory fashion to involve people as co-researchers and all of that, and providing training to them and so forth, more clearly framed that as broader impacts. But that was a learning experience for me, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Those of us who do that sort of engaged participatory research, it's very hard for us to separate that as a broader impact. That almost feels disingenuous, I think, in some ways at the end of that, at the end of the curve. It almost feels like I can't separate that into just an impact because that's part of the study itself. So anyway, all that to say, I wonder if you could go back to that for a minute and share a little bit more. And then my other thing is, I think it would be great if you could talk a little bit about co-review and how we can think about what to pick for co-review and when that might or might not be appropriate.
Yep, sure. So the difference between broader impacts and sort of the applied nature of the product of the project is what the sort of overall goals of the project are. I think uh, it's helpful to sort of think of broader impacts as more sort of speculative. There are certain kinds of things that you can do in terms of broader impacts that are tangible, like a student training, a plan for what they're now calling co-production of knowledge. I think it's borrowed from the citizen science circles, but it's kind of making the rounds in review now. That is that the people who are actually participants in the study or stakeholders in the communities and so forth are actually involved actively in the collection, analysis, and dissemination of the data. It's both. If you look at co-production of knowledge, that's actually part of the intellectual merit as well. You're ensuring that you're ensuring respondent validity is essentially what you're doing. It's that the categories that you're using, the thematic codes that you're using, the conclusions that you're drawing have validity within the communities that you're conducting. But it's also, from an NSF standpoint, building the capacity to continue to do research there in the future, and capacity building is considered part of building scientific infrastructure, just as if you were to build a lab. If you're a field scientist, having the capacity to use human, natural laboratories in the future does that. So it's some of these things are kind of span both, and anthropology, that there you might have co-production as a kind of important sort of broader impact, and you're disseminating research to these communities that in a way that's more inclusive. Say if they're Native American communities or something. But then within anthropology, this is an important part of ensuring the validity of the findings and the validity of the results. People have adopted these things that are what are called decolonial methods and so forth. So I think it's just a matter of trying to compartmentalize which parts of it are part of the collection, part of the research design, and which parts, which things are designed to sort of create pathways for deliverability in the future. If you're looking at a public health project, for example, there's clear, in medical anthropology, there's medical sociology, there's clear ways in which the results can be disseminated in non-academic settings to different sorts of organizations and so forth that will have a clear social good in the future. But then you want to make sure that that when you're talking about it in the body of the intellectual merit section or in the research questions generally, that those dissemination practices aren't driving the research, but they're driving the quality of the research design. There's a feedback from that's designed to help. I don't know if that helps at all. It helps a little bit more if I get sort of I've tried to pick out specific examples because it's easier to talk about when you're engaged with a particular kind of case, because what I'm going to say about a developmental economist versus a medical anthropologist versus applied linguistics or something is going to be a little bit different. But hopefully that helps. Co-review. So I think of co-review as it's not double jeopardy to do it. That isn't always the case. So some programs, say in the social and economic sciences, a poorly co-reviewed project from another program might be evaluated as having deficiencies that are less about the appropriateness for co-review. And so if they see two fair ratings, let's say one of the political science programs is co-reviewing with law and science. And the law and science people looked at it and said, there's no interdisciplinary socio-legal studies in this. It's really two political scientists that are trying to ask questions about maybe crime statistics or something. And that's what they write in the reviews. But then the political science program, security and preparedness or whatever it is, looks at it and says, oh, there are two fairs. If they don't, hopefully they've looked beyond just the substance of the actual ratings and towards the substance of the reviews. But generally, certainly I can speak for my program and for a number of the programs in BCS, when you've asked for co-review for from some other program and it doesn't do well, it's fine. You just lose that crack at the apple. The advantage of co-review is that when you have multiple programs co-reviewing, it increases the likelihood if they can get funded, particularly if it's competitive across these different programs. So there's been a number of cases where I've looked at a $450,000 project and said, I don't know if I want to give up 2 projects to fund that project. I've got 10 things in competitive categories here. I can maybe fund like 5 of them. And I've got to make some choices. There's some opportunity costs here. This project, in terms of the science it delivers to me, isn't worth as much as these 2 smaller projects. But then if I have a co-reviewing program that's willing to split that cost with me, now the likelihood that I can fund it is significantly higher. I can think of several cases over the years where projects would not have been funded if it wasn't for the co-review, just because the contribution wasn't significant to anthropology in and of itself. So that's a real advantage. It always helps to sort of talk to the program officers for multiple programs. You can talk to whatever program officer you feel most comfortable with. They can do the introductions for you. It's helpful, I think, to have something written up in terms of a 1-page summary that you can share with the program officers. Otherwise, you get sort of it's going to vary from program to program, but some programs where they get a ton of inquiries are going to say, base it off a single sentence, and maybe it's not the most helpful answer. But the more explicitness that you can provide, I think the better responses you get from co-reviews. And you're always sort of welcome to contact me if you have questions about who to approach and who might be appropriate. When you're writing to a program, write to all the program officers in that program, not just to one of them, so that they're aware, or not multiple emails to multiple program officers, so that they're not talking over each other.
That's great advice. Thank you so much.
Maybe.
I have a question if other folks don't. So can you say something about the budget part? I've only sat on the graduate student ones, and it seems like no one ever pays attention to the budget part because the grad students aren't very good at doing it. But I also am not very good at doing that. So I don't know, should we really fret about that, or is it going to be constrained by some other entity? Do you have any advice about any of that?
So budgets are they're in student projects. We don't really look at them that much because they basically all cost the same. There's $20,000 direct cost limits for many programs. So some of them are a little bit less, but a couple are a little bit more. But basically everybody asks for the maximum. They're when you're looking at them, they're more or less even. The trade-offs are even. But at the senior level, you might have. I've had a couple projects that were $30,000 to $50,000 projects that were no brainers. It's like this person wants to go back to a site and provide a longitudinal analysis of whether the questions they asked 20 years ago are still there. Or they just want to go there for the summer. They're asking for $32,000. That absolutely. The panel kind of agrees. Versus something that might be asking a minor question and food security studies or language ideologies or something like that that costs like $500,000. And it's like, well, it's very important to that subfield. I get that, but if you ask, just in finding reviewers for this proposal, I had half that subfield review the proposal already. They're kind of speaking to the converted, preaching to the converted. So, as program officers, we kind of look at budgets holistically, and we're asking questions, and that's actually how we were supposed to negotiate budgets. We can't tell you, for example, like you have to take out that postdoc. We can say it's not clear what the postdoc adds to the project, but we can't actually intercede to what your research office has done. I would say that the general advice I always give about budgets is ask for what you need. Which sounds like well, of course you're going to ask for what you need, but you'd be surprised how few people do that, just because the research office will make determinations about what you need instead, and they will say, tack 2 GRAs onto every single proposal, and then 2 months of summer salary, and call it a day, and 2 GRAs for a program like mine, a GRA can cost $100,000 a year. It's expensive, and just one of them is kind of more than what our program can afford. We can fund about $100,000 a year per year of the project for a 3-year project. So I'm not sure it's always the best use of money, particularly if the objective is to conduct field research, and the GRA is sitting back in Baltimore County and doing what related to the project. A better use of your funds might be actually to buy out your time to go to the field, or to hire field assistants who can help you, or to get an adequate per diem to cover your costs in the field and so forth. Any of those sorts of things might be more a valuable use of resources than what accountants who aren't familiar with the science have decided are general sorts of costs associated with it. But particularly in the social sciences, where even programs that sort of appear on paper to have a large budget, like economics, for example, there's a lot of cost cutting. There's we have to be very conservative in terms of what we're funding. Other programs and other directorates, can afford a windfall in certain areas, and that's doable. It's one of the things I noticed when I went to DICES, actually. I look at these $1.6 million budgets, and I can't believe the number of things that are in them that that my own program would never have the resources to support. But yeah.
So Jeff, just to piggyback on that with a very quick follow-up, when you say ask for what you need, I've seen folks interpret that in 2 ways. One is to be super specific and streamlined about only asking for what they need, and other people interpret it as ask for the kitchen sink and they will tell you if you have to scale back. I feel like it only stands to reason that you might have a better shot if you have the narrower budget, but maybe I'm reading it wrong. I've always sort of tended to be on the conservative budget side, and I'm in awe of people who have the moxie to be on the expansive budget mentality side.
I think it's
Can you weigh in? Yeah.
It's going to vary by program. Some programs kind of instruct their panelists not to look too closely at the budgets. There's different sorts of philosophies about this at the NSF. My philosophy, of course, is the one that's right. But I consider budgets to be an integral part of the project and an integral part of the merit review process. That are people asking for the resources that are necessary to conduct the research that they want to conduct? Will they have the resources that are necessary to do it? And are they asking for things that are unnecessary? Seems to be a part of that. Other people sort of interpret some of our internal policy documents a little bit differently, but. You'll have people read various levels here, and some reviewers will just look at the bottom line and say, well, it's an interesting project, but gosh, it's expensive. Others will say, It's expensive, but if you look at the budget, there's a lot of fluff in here, and there's a lot of things that actually could be cut. And then you'll have program officers that'll do the same thing. You know, they'll look at they'll look at sticker shock and sort of shy away from it, or they'll say like, let's look at the budget. You know, if they're asking for 450, if I were to offer them 320, do you think they could do it? Where would they cut? They cut this. Yeah, I think they could do it. And that's typically how I've negotiated budgets. We had a former co-director of mine had because we can't tell people where to cut, had a case where we asked them to cut, and the research office decided to cut all the actual research out of it and hold on to the graduate student components of it because that's what they wanted. And we said, well, you won't be able to get the data then. And they said, well, too bad you can't tell us what to cut. And we said, we're not funding it then. And they backed down. There's, you know, I think it's going to really vary from program to program. I would ask, you know, I know how I'd answer it. I can imagine how a program like econ or DRMS or you know, methodology, measurement, statistics might vary from mine, and it's worth asking those program officers specifically. Okay. And I'm not in a rush to get out of here, so I'll stay as long as you want.
And Jeff, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the balance between, you know, so you always hear in these review criteria that, you know, you ideally want your proposal to be hypothesis based, and that the hypotheses need to be, you know, clearly stated and testable, versus this notion that you mentioned, which is, oh, we should be open to unexpected results and discoveries. And in particular, from the social sciences perspective, there's a lot of work that maybe isn't as effective if it's in a hypothesis-driven manner, right? You know, there's a lot of empirical database work that certainly could be very hypothesis-driven, but you know, more theoretical work, sort of, you kind of have to start doing it until you start understanding what the you know, emerging properties of, you know, whatever human or natural system or integrated system you're looking at. And so I often struggle getting at, you know, describing what I want to do and then putting into a well-defined and testable hypothesis, because we don't know until we try.
So in my own program, I think the majority of projects that we fund, I've never actually done an actual analysis of this, but speaking without any empirical framework grounding at all, I think the majority of what we fund don't actually have hypotheses in them. And often anthropologists use the word hypothesis poorly. They use it as a synonym for what they really, really, really want to be true, rather than what they intend to test. So I always tell people in my program that, you know, if you're not comfortable with a hypothesis testing framework, don't use it. And that's because anthropology, by and large, tends to be more inductive in its approach. You'll find this with DICES too. A lot of field research is by design much more inductive. If you're a psychologist, the framework tends to be much more deductive and you know, more circumscribed. There's some exceptions to that, maybe in social psych or in some other you know, subdisciplines, but for the most part, in cultural psychology, for example, but for the most part, the design tends to be they tend to want a regimentation of design. I've noticed this actually when anthropologists try to work with psychologists, and anthropologists want to adopt this more sort of open and kind of exploratory framework, and it's not working with the models that they want to use. So in terms of addressing like the weird problem in psychology, the problem of sampling bias to Western societies and so forth, that's been you know, a point of contention. So it's going to vary from field to field, but I think you'll find, particularly among field-based sciences at NSF, there's much more flexibility with the kind of style of presenting it. Hypothesis testing is a hypodeductive framework in the philosophy of science. It's designed as a deductive framework, and if you're letting the data really inform the conclusions and the analytical framework, it's going to be a different kind of approach. So I think you'll find it's a bit more forgiving. There are programs that kind of sit right on the interstices of those two things, like sociology, for example. It might change from year to year depending on who's on the panel. But you know, an econ is surprisingly more forgiving. They're more interested in heterodox and behavioral approaches than they're sometimes given credit for. But it's really worth speaking specifically to the program officer. I can tell you for anthropology and DICES, if you're not comfortable using a hypothesis testing framework, don't use it. Use research questions that are open-ended. They should be empirically driven. They should be testable. That is, the data tells you something that in some sense can falsify some sort of principle. They shouldn't be tautological, but they don't have to be, you know, an if-then statement.
It's really helpful. Thank you.
Ask me anything.
Jeff, if we really can ask you anything, I know that other people have asked me about how people are selected to be on review panels and how people might find out more about doing that. Could you say something about that maybe? And
Yeah.
what the perks are, how great the company is?
Yeah, panels at NSF for the last year have been virtual. I did my last in-person panels almost exactly a year ago, about 72 hours. We had a DICES panel end about 72 hours before the whole planet went to hell. But we thought we were going to make it. but normally a lot of them are in person at the NSF, and some of that may change in the future. They're wonderful opportunities for building networks and collaborations, for making friends, we've seen a ton of scientific collaborations emerge between people who were on a panel together and didn't even know that each other existed, weren't aware even necessarily that subfield that they worked in existed. So in terms of the human dimension, they're really interesting. I think I was a panelist for a number of years before I came to NSF as a program officer in 2012, and I loved doing it. And the reason it was the most exciting thing I did in my life at that point in time, which may say more about me than NSF. But the reason I liked it so much is it made me understand how big my field was. You know, I remember going onto the panel for the first time, and I didn't recognize the names of most of the people that were on the panel. When they explained to me what they did, I didn't even realize that was anthropology. You know, it's exciting to sort of build out after being in an academic position where you're building into such a focused area for such a long period of time. So if that's something that's really exciting to you, it's really cool to be an NSF panelist. Every year I try to learn a new subfield that I don't feel. This year I'm learning social network analysis, or I'm trying. Yeah, writing the program officer and letting them know that you're interested in being a reviewer and/or panelist is you know, a great way to do it. Some programs actually send out blasts from time to time and ask you to sort of register in their database of potential reviewers. Some programs have a college of reviewers. So some of the psychology programs actually have a college of reviewers that they rely on for, you know, up to 5 proposals a year or something like that in any given year. Biological, cultural anthropology actually have, you know, a list you can write to. Siobhan knows more about that than I do. And I'm 50 now, so I've lost the capacity to do anything technological. But it's just always writing to the program officer is a great idea. It's an exciting opportunity. It gets you really good at writing your own proposals, and it's just fun. It's a lot of work. It's a downside.
It's great advice. Anybody else have any questions or thoughts for Jeff? Okay, well, hearing none, thank you so much for joining us. This was super helpful.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And just one last thing, important thing to keep in mind is that when I answer my email or my phone or any of those sorts of things, I'm actually not doing you a favor. It's my job. I'm a civil servant. So please always feel free to contact us.
I think you will probably have folks taking you up on that generous offer. So thank you so much. This was great, Jeff. We will also send you the link to the recording when we send it out, just in case you'd like to have that as well. And I think there'll be a lot of folks watching the recording after the fact too and saving your slides. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. And thank you again, Bambi, for the introduction. So this was great. All right, well, enjoy this beautiful sunny day.